In the golden city of Alexandria, long ago, a young princess named Cleopatra was born into the royal house of the Ptolemies, descendants of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's trusted generals. Though her family was Greek, Cleopatra was different. She learned the Egyptian language, spoke to her people in their own tongue, and embraced their customs. She was clever, proud, and determined to rule in her own right. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died, Cleopatra became queen at just 18, ruling beside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. But power rarely shares easily. Their alliance soon crumbled into rivalry and war. At the same time, far away in Rome, two mighty men, Julius Caesar and Pompey, were battling for control of the empire. After losing, Pompey fled to Egypt for safety, but the young king, hoping to impress Caesar, had him murdered. When Caesar arrived and learned what had been done, he was furious. In the chaos that followed, Cleopatra slipped secretly into his camp. Wrapped in a rug, legend says, she was carried to him, and when it unfurled, the queen emerged. Caesar was captivated. Together, they fought and won the war against her brother's forces at the Battle of the Nile, after which Cleopatra became Egypt's ruler once again. She and Caesar formed both a political and personal bond, and she bore him a son, Caesarion. For a time, Cleopatra lived in Rome, dazzling its people with her intelligence and splendor. But when Caesar was assassinated, she fled back to Egypt. Not long after, her brother died mysteriously, and she made Caesarion her co-ruler. Years later, the Roman world was ruled by three men, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. When Cleopatra met Antony, sparks flew. They fell deeply in love, and their union produced three children. Cleopatra and Antony ruled side by side, their court filled with riches and ceremony. Yet Rome saw them as a threat. When Antony granted kingdoms to their children, Octavian declared war. Their fleet was crushed at the Battle of Actium, and Rome marched upon Egypt. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, fell on his own sword. When she learned of his death, Cleopatra chose her own end, legend says by the bite of a cobra, rather than be paraded as a trophy in Rome. With her death, Egypt's long line of pharaohs ended, and Rome claimed the land as its own. But Cleopatra's story lived on, not only as the tale of a queen and her lovers, but of a woman whose charm, intellect, and courage made her one of the most unforgettable figures in history. Long before Cleopatra's birth, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemaic pharaohs, Greek kings and queens, who had inherited the land after Alexander the Great conquered it. Though they wore the crowns of Egypt and were blessed by the high priest of Ptah at the sacred city of Memphis, they did not live among the temples and sands of the old pharaohs. Instead, they ruled from Alexandria, a glittering city by the sea, filled with marble palaces, Greek theaters, and scholars from every corner of the world. These rulers spoke Greek, followed Greek customs, and thought of themselves as Hellenistic monarchs, not as Egyptians. Most refused to learn the Egyptian language, keeping a distance between themselves and the people they ruled. But Cleopatra was different. By the time she became queen, she could speak many languages. Ancient writers said she spoke Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, or Aramaic, and even the tongues of Ethiopia, Syria, Media, and Parthia. Her gift for languages wasn't just for show. It was part of her vision to rebuild Egypt's influence over the lands once ruled by her ancestors in North Africa and the Middle East. She was a ruler who wanted to understand her people, not stand apart from them. Yet even before her rise, Egypt had already fallen under the shadow of Rome. Years earlier, her grandfather Ptolemy IX Lathyrus had died, and the throne passed to his daughter Berenice III. Some at court opposed the idea of a woman ruling alone, so she agreed to share power and marry her cousin and stepson Ptolemy XI Alexander II, a match arranged by the powerful Roman general Sulla. The union was short and tragic. Ptolemy XI killed Berenice III soon after their wedding, shocking the people of Alexandria. Enraged, the citizens stormed the palace and tore him apart in revenge. But the damage was done. Before his death, Ptolemy XI and possibly other kings before him, had promised Egypt to Rome as security for debts. That gave the Romans a legal excuse to claim Egypt as their own whenever they wished. Instead of taking Egypt outright, Rome decided to split the kingdom. They handed Egypt to Ptolemy, the 12th Auletes, Cleopatra's father, and Cyprus to another son of the same royal line. It was a political move that kept Egypt under Roman influence, a control that would only grow stronger until the time of Cleopatra herself. In the Grand Palace of Alexandria, surrounded by marble halls and the blue shimmer of the Mediterranean, a child was born in early 69 BC. Her name was Cleopatra VII. She was the daughter of King Ptolemy the 12th Auletes, ruler of Egypt, and her mother is believed to have been Cleopatra V Tryphena, the queen who soon vanished from the royal records not long after her daughter's birth. Cleopatra grew up in a house of both splendor and tension. Her older sister, Berenice IV, had already been born, and after Cleopatra came her younger siblings, Arsinoe IV, Ptolemy XIII, and Ptolemy XIV, all born after their mother's mysterious disappearance. The palace was filled with whispers of politics and danger, for the throne of Egypt was a prize constantly threatened by rivals both within and beyond its borders. As a child, Cleopatra was not like other royal children. She was curious and quick-minded. Her tutor, Philostratos, taught her the Greek arts of philosophy, public speaking, and leadership, and she learned to command language as powerfully as any sword. She likely spent many hours at the Great Library of Alexandria, the beating heart of ancient knowledge, where scholars from across the world gathered to study the stars, the earth, and the words of poets and philosophers. In those early years, the young princess absorbed everything: languages, science, politics, and the secrets of persuasion. While other rulers of her bloodline spoke only Greek, Cleopatra would one day master the tongues of many nations. Even as a child, she was being shaped into the queen who would stand above them all, one who could speak to every heart and every land. Years before Cleopatra's rise to power, Egypt trembled under the uncertain rule of her father, King Ptolemy XII Auletes. The glory of the old pharaohs had faded, and the growing might of Rome cast a long shadow over the Nile. In 65 BC, the powerful Roman senator Marcus Crassus urged Rome to seize Egypt for itself. Though his plan failed, the message was clear: Egypt's independence was in danger. Desperate to protect his throne, Ptolemy began sending gold and gifts to the most influential Romans, first to Pompey, the celebrated general, and later to Julius Caesar when he became consul. His generosity kept Rome at bay, but it emptied Egypt's treasury. To stay afloat, the king borrowed heavily from a wealthy Roman banker named Gaius Rabirius Postumus, binding Egypt's future to Rome's will. In 58 BC, tragedy struck. Rome seized the island of Cyprus, accusing Ptolemy XII's brother of piracy. Refusing exile, his brother took his own life. Ptolemy said nothing, a silence that enraged the Egyptian people, who already despised his costly dealings with Rome. The anger grew into open revolt, and the king was forced to flee Egypt. Taking his young daughter Cleopatra, barely 11 years old, Ptolemy fled first to Rhodes, then Athens, and finally to Italy, where he sought refuge in the villa of Pompey. From there, he plotted his return. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, his eldest daughter Berenice IV seized the throne. She sent envoys to Rome to argue against her father's restoration, but Ptolemy had the Roman-backed assassins strike them down, a scandal quietly buried by his powerful allies. When the Roman Senate refused to grant him soldiers for his return, Ptolemy took sanctuary at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, waiting for a chance to reclaim his kingdom. That chance came in 55 BC, when Pompey persuaded Aulus Gabinius, the Roman governor of Syria, to invade Egypt for a huge bribe of 10,000 talents. Gabinius agreed, even though it broke Roman law. With Roman legions marching through Judea, aided by Hyrcanus II and his advisor Antipater, the father of Herod the Great, the invasion began. Among Gabinius's officers was a young cavalryman named Mark Antony, who distinguished himself in battle, stopping Ptolemy's men from massacring civilians and giving Berenice IV's slain husband, Archelaus, a proper royal burial. Later, Antony would recall that he first saw the young Cleopatra, then about 14, during this campaign, and that her image never left his heart. Once restored to power, Ptolemy XII unleashed vengeance on those who had supported his rebel daughter. Berenice IV and her wealthy allies were executed, their fortunes seized. The Roman soldiers who had fought for him, known as the Gabiniani, remained in Alexandria and soon became a lawless occupying force, terrorizing the people. The king's Roman banker, Rabirius, was made chief treasurer, but his harsh collection of debts stirred more hatred. Despite the turmoil, Ptolemy managed to rebuild parts of Egypt. He sponsored new temples at Edfu and Dendera, restored order to the economy, and planned carefully for succession. He named Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII as joint heirs to the throne, the first sign that he saw greatness in his daughter. An inscription from the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, dated 31st May 52 BC, records that Cleopatra had already been named co-regent beside her father. When he died soon after, the vast debts to Rome remained unpaid. Those debts, and the fate of Egypt itself, now passed to his brilliant young heir, Cleopatra VII, Queen of the Nile. When King Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC, the throne of Egypt passed to his young daughter, Cleopatra VII, and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. Barely in her late teens, Cleopatra's first act as queen showed her deep respect for Egypt's traditions. She journeyed south to Hermonthis, near Thebes, to oversee the installation of a new sacred Bacchus bull, believed to be the living vessel of the god Montu. It was a solemn and royal beginning to her reign. But Egypt's troubles came quickly. The Nile's floodwaters had failed, leaving the land stricken with famine, and the Gabiniani, Roman soldiers left behind by Gabinius years earlier, had grown restless and lawless, turning the streets of Alexandria into chaos. On top of this, Cleopatra inherited her father's enormous debt to Rome, over 17 million drachmas. Then, in 50 BC, two sons of Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, the Roman governor of Syria, came to Egypt to negotiate with the Gabiniani. Instead, they were brutally murdered, perhaps with help from corrupt officials within Cleopatra's own court. Trying to do what was right, Cleopatra sent the murderers back to Bibulus for judgment, but he returned them with scorn, reminding her that such matters were for the Roman Senate, not an Egyptian queen. Despite these troubles, Cleopatra held firm. By August 51 BC, her name alone appeared on official documents, proof that she had rejected Ptolemy XIII as co-ruler, though she may have been forced by tradition to marry him. Like her ancestors, Cleopatra's family practiced sibling marriage, a custom honored by the ancient pharaohs but despised by the Greeks. Yet by her time, it was seen as a normal part of the royal house of Egypt. Still, her brother was not willing to fade quietly into the background. Ptolemy XIII, guided by his scheming regent Pothinos, his tutor, Theodotus of Chios, and the ambitious general Achilles, began to plot against Cleopatra. Power slipped from her hands as their supporters clashed in Alexandria. Though Cleopatra briefly sought an alliance with another brother, Ptolemy XIV, it was Ptolemy XIII who gained the upper hand. By 49 BC, his name appeared before hers on decrees, and he claimed the throne entirely for himself. That same year, war was tearing apart Rome. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, forcing Pompey the Great to flee to Greece. Cleopatra and her brother were still locked in civil war when Pompey's son, Neos, arrived in Alexandria seeking aid for his father. In a rare show of unity, both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII agreed to send 60 ships and 500 soldiers, including Gabiniani troops, to support him, an offering that eased some of Egypt's massive debt to Rome. But their fragile alliance soon shattered again. Cleopatra's forces were defeated, and she was driven out of Alexandria, retreating south to Thebes. From there, she traveled east into Syria with her sister Arsinoe IV, determined to raise an army and reclaim her throne. She gathered her forces and returned, marching toward Egypt, but near Pelusium, at the edge of the Nile Delta, her path was blocked by her brother's army. Meanwhile, in Greece, the fate of Rome itself was decided. At the Battle of Pharsalus, on 9th August 48 BC, Caesar's legions crushed Pompey's army. Pompey fled across the sea, first to Tyre, then, hoping for refuge among old allies, to Egypt. But Ptolemy's advisors feared that sheltering Pompey might draw Caesar's wrath or make Egypt a battlefield. Acting on Theodotus's advice, they lured Pompey to shore near Pelusium and murdered him before he could step onto land. Ptolemy XIII believed he had shown cleverness and loyalty to Caesar. He had Pompey's head preserved and sent as a gift to the Roman general when Caesar arrived in Alexandria days later. But Caesar, horrified at the treachery, was not impressed. When Caesar entered the royal palace in early October 48 BC, he expressed grief and outrage over Pompey's death. Then, with the weight of Rome behind him, he summoned Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra, commanding them both to lay down their armies and make peace, an order that would soon change the fate of Egypt forever. As Julius Caesar took up residence in the royal palace of Alexandria, tension filled the air. Ptolemy XIII, defiant and proud, arrived at the head of his army, openly disobeying Caesar's command to disband his troops. His sister, Cleopatra, realized that only a bold and personal meeting could turn the tide. She first sent emissaries, but when she learned that Caesar admired intelligence and charm, she decided to meet him face to face. According to one story, she slipped into the palace at night, dressed in her finest robes, radiant and confident, capturing Caesar's attention with her wit and presence. Another legend, told by Plutarch, claims she was smuggled into Caesar's quarters rolled inside a carpet, or linen sack. When the bundle was unwrapped, the young queen stood before the Roman general, and history was forever changed. When Ptolemy XIII discovered that Cleopatra had entered the palace and won Caesar's favor, he flew into a rage. He tried to rally the people of Alexandria against her, but Caesar arrested him before chaos could spread. Before the Egyptian court and its people, Caesar produced the will of Ptolemy XII, which confirmed Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII as joint heirs to the throne. To ease tensions, Caesar proposed sending their younger siblings, Arsinoe IV and Ptolemy XIV, to rule over Cyprus, hoping to secure peace. But Ptolemy's allies, the scheming Pothinos, the ambitious general Achilles, and the tutor Theodotus of Chios, saw that Caesar favored Cleopatra. Believing their army could crush the Romans' smaller force, Pothinos ordered Achilles to march on the palace. The siege of Alexandria began. Caesar had Pothinos executed, but Arsinoe escaped and joined the rebel forces, claiming the title of queen. She soon had Achilles killed and replaced him with Ganymedes, her tutor, who tricked Caesar into releasing Ptolemy XIII as a negotiator. Instead, the young king joined Arsinoe's army. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra were trapped together in the palace while the city outside turned into a battlefield. The siege lasted well into 47 BC until reinforcements led by Mithridates of Pergamon and Antipater the Idumean, father of Herod the Great, arrived. Caesar struck back fiercely, defeating Ptolemy's forces along the Nile River. Ptolemy XIII fled by boat, but it overturned, and the boy king drowned in the waters that had once made Egypt rich. Arsinoe IV was captured and later paraded in Caesar's triumph in Rome, humiliated before being exiled to the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. By then, Cleopatra was pregnant with Caesar's child. With her rival brother dead, Caesar appointed her co-ruler with her 12-year-old brother Ptolemy XIV, in name only. In truth, Cleopatra ruled alone. Stories spread that Caesar and Cleopatra sailed together down the Nile, traveling in royal splendor aboard the magnificent Thalamigos, a floating palace nearly 90 meters long with dining halls, shrines, and colonnades. Whether the voyage was fact or legend, it symbolized their power and alliance. Caesar was fascinated by Egypt's mysteries and geography, though he turned back before reaching Ethiopia. By April 47 BC, Caesar left Egypt to face new threats in Asia Minor, where he famously declared, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. He left behind Roman legions to secure Cleopatra's rule and perhaps to keep watch on her. That summer, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Caesarion, whom she declared to be Caesar's child. Though Caesar never publicly acknowledged him, many believed he did so in private. In 46 BC, Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIV traveled to Rome, where Caesar welcomed them and lodged them in his villa across the Tiber River. Rome buzzed with curiosity and scandal. The Egyptian queen, draped in silks and jewels, was the talk of the empire. Caesar erected a golden statue of Cleopatra in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, linking her with Venus, the divine mother of Rome, and with Isis, the goddess of Egypt. But not everyone was charmed. The Roman statesman Cicero called her arrogant, and whispers filled the Senate halls. Still, her presence influenced Caesar's court. Her scholars even helped design the Julian calendar, which would become the foundation of timekeeping for centuries. Then, in 44 BC, at the Lupercalia festival, Cleopatra's influence seemed to echo through the crowd when Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a royal diadem, a crown, which Caesar refused. The moment was staged, perhaps to test whether Rome would accept a king, but the gesture stirred unease. Only weeks later, on the Ides of March, Caesar was assassinated. Cleopatra, who had remained in Rome, stayed until mid-April, hoping to have her son Caesarion recognized as Caesar's heir. But when Caesar's will was read, the inheritance passed instead to his adopted grandnephew, Octavian. Grieving and uncertain, Cleopatra returned to Egypt. Soon after, her young brother Ptolemy XIV died. Many believed by poison, likely on her orders. With him gone, Cleopatra elevated her son Caesarion, the child of the great Julius Caesar, as King Ptolemy XV, co-ruler of Egypt. The queen had survived war, siege, and betrayal, and now ruled a kingdom more powerful and more fragile than ever before. After the death of Julius Caesar, Rome once again fell into chaos. To restore order, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate in 43 BC. Three powerful men granted 5 years of near-absolute rule to avenge Caesar's death and rebuild the Republic. In distant Alexandria, Queen Cleopatra watched the storm unfold. Both Caesar's assassin Gaius Cassius Longinus and Caesar's loyalist Publius Cornelius Dolabella sent her letters, pleading for military aid. The queen replied to Cassius with a clever excuse. Egypt, she said, faced too many troubles to spare troops, while secretly sending Caesar's old legions to Dolabella. But the gamble failed. Cassius captured the soldiers in Palestine, seizing them for his own army. Worse, Cleopatra's governor on Cyprus, Serapion, betrayed her and joined Cassius, offering ships to the enemy. Still, Cleopatra refused to yield. She personally set sail for Greece with her own fleet to join Antony and Octavian, but a violent storm tore her ships apart, forcing her to turn back. By the time she recovered, the war was over. Antony had crushed Cassius and Brutus at the Battle of Philippi, and the assassins of Caesar were dead by their own hands. Rome's vast world was now divided. Octavian ruled the west, Antony controlled the east, and Lepidus, fading from power, was left in between. In 41 BC, Antony set up his command in Tarsos, in modern Turkey, and summoned Cleopatra. For weeks she ignored him, until his envoy Quintus Dellius persuaded her that this was an opportunity, not a summons. When Cleopatra finally came, she did so in unforgettable splendor. Sailing up the Kidnos River aboard the Thalamigos, her enormous golden barge, she reclined beneath silk sails of purple, surrounded by incense, music, and attendants dressed as cupids. The scent of perfume drifted across the water. Antony, dazzled by her arrival, invited himself aboard, and for 2 nights, the queen hosted him with feasts and music that rivaled the gods. In their meetings, Cleopatra cleared her name, convincing Antony she had never supported Cassius and had instead tried to aid Caesar's loyalist Dolabella. She also won his favor to execute her treacherous sister Arsinoe IV, who had once raised arms against her, and her faithless governor Serapion. Their partnership had begun, part alliance, part romance. Before leaving, Cleopatra invited Antony to Egypt. By November 41 BC, he accepted. In Alexandria, Antony was received not as a conqueror but as a friend. The people cheered him. He had restored Cleopatra's father years before and had not come with an occupying army like Caesar had. Together, the two rulers lived in luxury. Feasts, theater, and laughter filled the halls of the royal palace. Cleopatra, ever strategic, chose Antony as her partner for both power and legacy. He was Caesar's heir in strength and authority, with command over Rome's eastern provinces, and he could return to her the lands once ruled by her ancestors. Their time together was passionate and politically fruitful. Cleopatra gained control over Cyprus and parts of Cilicia, her influence spreading across the Mediterranean. In early 40 BC, Antony was forced to leave Egypt to face new threats in Syria, where his forces were under attack by Quintus Labienus, a Roman general now serving the Parthians. Cleopatra provided him with 200 ships and rich supplies for his campaign. Soon after, she gave birth to twins, a boy, Alexander Helios, the sun, and a girl, Cleopatra Selene II, the moon. The names reflected her belief in destiny. Together, they symbolized renewal and divine rule, as if she and Antony were gods reborn to bring light to the world. But while Cleopatra ruled Egypt and raised her children, Rome burned with jealousy and suspicion. Antony's wife Fulvia, angry at his devotion to the Egyptian queen, started a war in Italy to defend his name and power. She failed and died soon after, forcing Antony and Octavian to reconcile at Brundisium in 40 BC. As part of their peace, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, creating a fragile alliance and a rival for Cleopatra. That same year, Herod, fleeing turmoil in Judea, sought refuge in Cleopatra's court. She offered him protection and a role in her service, but he refused, heading to Rome instead. There, Antony and Octavian crowned him king of Judea, a decision that would later pit him against Cleopatra for control of lands she once claimed. Despite Antony's new marriage, Cleopatra's throne remained secure. She ruled a wealthy kingdom, her ships commanded the seas, and her people adored her. By 37 BC, Antony and Octavia arranged a renewal of the triumvirate in Tarentum, granting Antony more troops for his Parthian campaign. When Antony arrived in Antioch, he summoned Cleopatra to join him. She came with her twins, now 3 years old, and Antony saw his children for the first time. There, he expanded her territories as part of his grand plan to reorganize the East. Cleopatra gained lands across the Levant, almost all of Phoenicia, parts of Coele, and regions around Jericho and the Red Sea. She even received Cyrene, parts of Crete, and the coast of Libya. In return, she leased some of this land to Herod, a move that made him both ally and subject. The queen's empire was now larger and richer than it had been in a century. She struck new coins, double-dating them to mark the dawn of a new era. But her growing power stirred unease in Rome. Octavian, ever watchful, began spreading whispers that Antony had fallen under the spell of a foreign queen who threatened Rome's greatness. In 36 BC, Cleopatra accompanied Antony to the Euphrates River as he prepared his campaign against the Parthians. She soon returned to Egypt, heavily pregnant. That summer, she bore another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. But Antony's campaign ended in disaster. Betrayed by the Armenian king Artavasdes II, he lost tens of thousands of soldiers and retreated in humiliation. Broken and weary, Antony returned to the coast near Berytus, modern Beirut, and drowned his shame in wine. Cleopatra came to meet him there, bringing gold, clothing, and comfort for his soldiers. Rather than return to Rome, Antony followed her back to Alexandria, to his queen and his children, and to the world he now called home. By 35 BC, the uneasy peace between Mark Antony and Octavian was beginning to crumble. Determined to recover from his failed Parthian campaign, Antony prepared for a new expedition, this time targeting Armenia, an ally of the Parthians. Meanwhile, in Rome, Octavian schemed to weaken his rival through the one person Antony could not openly defy: his Roman wife, Octavia. Octavia set out for Athens with 2,000 soldiers, publicly claiming she wished to support her husband's campaign, but the gesture was likely designed by Octavian to humiliate Antony. When she arrived, Antony accepted the troops but refused to see her in person, instructing her to go no farther east. Instead, he turned once again to Cleopatra, traveling with her to Antioch. Then, suddenly and without explanation, he abandoned the campaign entirely and returned with the Egyptian queen to Alexandria. In Rome, Octavian seized the opportunity. He portrayed his sister as the faithful wife scorned by a man bewitched by a foreign queen. Octavia, however, refused to denounce Antony or leave his household. Her quiet dignity made Antony's absence look all the more shameful, and public opinion in Rome began to tilt toward Octavian. While Octavian tightened his grip on the west, defeating Sextus Pompeius and forcing Lepidus, the third triumvir, into retirement, Antony turned his attention to the east. In 34 BC, he sent his trusted envoy Dellius to King Artavasdes II of Armenia to propose a royal marriage between the Armenian princess and Alexander Helios, Antony's son, with Cleopatra. When the Armenian king refused, Antony invaded. His army crushed Armenia's forces and captured the royal family, parading them in chains. Instead of celebrating his triumph in Rome, Antony staged a grand spectacle in Alexandria. Wearing the robes of Dionysus, he entered the city in a chariot, leading the captured kings before him, while Cleopatra, dressed in gold and crowned as Isis reborn, watched from a silver throne. The city erupted in celebration, but in Rome, outrage followed. To the senators and people of the Republic, Antony had committed blasphemy, turning Rome's sacred victory rites into a private show for an Egyptian queen. Soon after, Cleopatra appeared again before the people in the gymnasium of Alexandria, her head adorned with the crown of Isis. With regal ceremony, she proclaimed herself Queen of Kings and her son Caesarion as King of Kings. Before the gathered crowds, she announced new titles for her children. Alexander Helios would rule Armenia, Media, and Parthia. Cleopatra Selina II would rule Crete and Cyrene. And little Ptolemy Philadelphus, still a toddler, was named King of Syria and Cilicia. Antony stood beside her, radiant and proud. Many believed they were secretly married during this ceremony, a direct challenge to Rome, where Antony was still legally married to Octavia. The event would be remembered as the Donations of Alexandria, a display of wealth and defiance that stunned the ancient world. When news of the spectacle reached Rome, the reaction was furious. Antony sent a report asking the Senate to ratify the new kingdoms, but Octavian used the event as a weapon in a growing war of propaganda. He painted Antony as a traitor who had surrendered himself to an Eastern temptress. Antony, in turn, accused Octavian of stealing power illegally, removing Lepidus, and denying him troops. Both sides filled the world with rumors. Roman poets whispered that Cleopatra had bewitched Antony with sorcery. Others compared her to Helen of Troy, a woman so beautiful she brought nations to ruin. Pliny the Elder would later tell that Cleopatra dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar, drinking it to win a wager that she could consume the wealth of an empire in a single meal. Such stories, born of rivalry and resentment, would echo through history, shaping Cleopatra's legend as both goddess and seductress. Amid this turmoil, a papyrus dated February 33 BC survives as a quiet relic of the real queen. A document granting tax exemptions, likely signed by Cleopatra herself. At the bottom, in faint Greek letters, she had written a single word: Ginestoi, ginestoi. Make it happen. It was the mark of a ruler who, even as the world turned against her, still commanded power with her own hand. By 33 BC, the uneasy alliance between Mark Antony and Octavian had completely unraveled. In the Roman Senate, Octavian, now young, ambitious, and ruthless, stood to speak on the first day of his consulship. Before the gathered senators, he thundered accusations that Antony had become the slave of an Eastern queen, Cleopatra, and had betrayed Roman honor to her seductive influence. Antony struck back in his own way. Before the triumvirate's authority expired, he boldly declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as Caesar's true heir, an open challenge to Octavian's claim. The world began to divide, East versus West, Egypt against Rome. In 32 BC, Antony's allies, Gaius Sosius and Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, became consuls in Rome. Sosius denounced Octavian in fiery speeches, But Octavian soon entered the Senate armed with soldiers, silencing his enemies through fear. The consuls and over 200 senators fled Rome to join Antony in the east. The Republic was on the brink of its final war. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their strength at Ephesus, uniting their forces for the coming conflict. Cleopatra provided 200 of Antony's 800 ships, as well as gold and supplies to fund the war. Some of Antony's Roman allies, uneasy about her influence, begged him to send her back to Egypt. But Publius Canidius Crassus, his general, argued that Cleopatra was the source of their money, their navy, and their morale. She refused to leave, insisting that by blocking Octavian in Greece, she would also protect Egypt itself. Their partnership divided Antony's ranks. Prominent Romans defected to Octavian, whispering that Antony had abandoned his Roman virtue for a queen's bed. Yet Cleopatra remained beside him. In the spring of 32 BC, Antony and Cleopatra traveled to Athens, where Cleopatra persuaded him to send a formal letter of divorce to his Roman wife, Octavia. The act gave Octavian his opportunity. Learning of Antony's will, he broke into the temple of Vesta, violating sacred law, and seized it. The will was read aloud before the Senate, its contents turning the Roman people against Antony. The document revealed Antony's deepest intentions, that Caesarion was named heir to Julius Caesar, that the donations of Alexandria were to be made permanent, that Antony wanted to be buried beside Cleopatra in Egypt, and that Alexandria, not Rome, was to be the new capital of the world. Octavian's voice thundered through Rome as he declared war, not against Antony, but against Cleopatra, the foreign queen who sought to enslave the Republic. By 31 BC, Octavian had secured the consulship once more, and Rome prepared for battle. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet was massive but disorganized. Many of their sailors were merchants and farmers turned oarsmen, while Octavian's fleet, led by the brilliant Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, was sleek, trained, and deadly. Antony wished to take the war to Italy and strike directly at Rome, but Cleopatra refused. Her priority was to defend Egypt, not to invade foreign shores. Together they made camp at Patrae, then moved to Actium, a small promontory on the western coast of Greece. There they gathered their allied kings, though some, like Herod of Judea and Malichus of Nabatea, had already withdrawn. The gods themselves seemed to abandon them. An earthquake struck Judea, and one by one Antony's generals defected to Octavian. As the summer heat rose, Cleopatra urged Antony to fight at sea, hoping to break Octavian's blockade before it could trap their fleet. On the morning of the 2nd of September, 31 BC, their ships set out across the blue waters of the Ambracian Gulf. The battle that followed would decide the fate of empires. Cleopatra commanded her flagship, the Grand Antonias, with its purple sails, and 60 vessels at the rear of the line. Antony's ships were larger and stronger, but weighed down by their size. As the fighting raged, Cleopatra raised her sails and cut through the smoke and fire, steering her fleet southward in a daring escape toward the open sea. Historians would later accuse her of cowardice, but many now believe the maneuver was prearranged, a strategic withdrawal to save Egypt's remaining strength. When Antony saw her purple sails vanish through the haze, he abandoned the battle and followed her. He boarded her ship as the two fled together toward Tyneron, silent for 3 days until her attendants convinced him to speak. Behind them, chaos ruled the sea. The battle raged until dawn, and by its end, Antony's forces were shattered. Thousands surrendered, allied kings switched sides. His empire crumbled in a single night. The Battle of Actium marked the fall of the East, and with it, the beginning of the end for Antony and Cleopatra. After the disastrous Battle of Actium, the once golden lovers Mark Antony and Cleopatra returned to the land that had given them both power and purpose, Egypt. Their ships landed at Paratonion, but the pair soon parted ways. Antony went west to Cyrene, desperate to raise a new army, while Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, pretending that the events in Greece had been a triumph, not a ruin. She filled the streets with celebrations, hoping to hide the truth, but rumors of their defeat spread quickly like a desert wind. Antony's appointed governor in Cyrene, Lucius Pinarius, received word of Octavian's victory before Antony's own messengers could reach him. Without hesitation, Pinarius executed Antony's envoys and defected to Octavian, handing over the 4 legions Antony had hoped to command. When Antony heard of this betrayal, he was so distraught that he nearly took his own life, stopped only by his remaining officers. In despair, he withdrew from public life, building himself a small, lonely cottage on the island of Pharos, naming it the Timonian, after Timon of Athens, the philosopher who had grown to despise mankind. Like Timon, Antony now lived in self-imposed exile, bitter, broken, and alone. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's allies continued to fall away. Herod of Judea, once loyal to Antony, journeyed to Rhodes to meet Octavian. There he offered to resign his kingship out of devotion to Antony. Octavian, impressed by Herod's loyalty and eloquence, not only forgave him but confirmed him as king, isolating Antony and Cleopatra even further. By the late summer of 31 BC, Cleopatra began to realize that Antony's presence was no longer a shield, but a weight dragging her kingdom down. She quietly prepared to crown her teenage son Caesarion as sole ruler of Egypt and dreamed of escape. Taking her ships through the Red Sea to seek refuge in faraway lands, perhaps India. But her plan was shattered when Malichus I, king of the Nabateans and an ally of Octavian, burned her fleet, leaving her trapped in Egypt with no path of retreat. Cleopatra, desperate and cornered, began testing the power of various poisons on prisoners and servants, searching for a death that would be swift, dignified, and painless. Still, she had not surrendered. She elevated Caesarion into the ranks of the Ephebi, symbolically announcing him as her successor, while Antony did the same for his son Antyllus, as though to prove they still ruled as kings. Both sent envoys to Octavian, pleading for mercy. Cleopatra offered wealth, her kingdom, and her loyalty, asking only that her children inherit Egypt and that Antony be allowed to live in exile beside her. Octavian, calculating as ever, answered only Cleopatra. His envoy, Thyrsos, visited her in Alexandria, secretly advising her to kill Antony to save her own life. When Antony discovered the plot, he had Thyrsos beaten and sent back in disgrace. Negotiations dragged on, but peace never came. In the spring of 30 BC, Octavian marched into Egypt. His ally Herod supplied his army with fresh provisions. Octavian's forces swiftly captured Pelusium, the gateway to Egypt. From the west, Cornelius Gallus advanced from Cyrene, defeating Antony's troops near Paratonion. Octavian pressed onward, reaching Alexandria itself. In a last desperate act, Antony led his weary men in one final charge outside the city's hippodrome, briefly defeating Octavian's advance guard. But his victory was hollow. On the 1st of August 30 BC, his navy surrendered, followed by his cavalry. The war was over. Cleopatra, seeing the end near, retreated into her tomb, sealing herself inside with her treasures. She sent word to Antony that she was dead. Believing her gone, Antony fell upon his own sword, crying out that he had lived as a soldier and would die as one. Gravely wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra's tomb, still breathing. In a moment of anguish and tenderness, Cleopatra had him lifted to her, blood covering her robes as she cradled him. He whispered that he had died honorably and begged her to trust Gaius Proculeius, Octavian's companion. Then Antony died in her arms. When Octavian arrived in Alexandria, he found Cleopatra hidden in her tomb once more. Proculeius, sent to secure her, climbed in through a window and seized her before she could set her treasures ablaze. She was brought to the palace, guarded but treated with a strange respect. When she finally stood before Octavian, Cleopatra, proud even in defeat, told him flatly, "I will not be led in a triumph." She meant she would not endure what her sister Arsinoe IV had suffered, being paraded in chains before the jeering crowds of Rome. Octavian promised her life, but she saw through his empty assurance. When she learned that he planned to take her and her children to Rome within 3 days, she prepared her final act. On 12th August 30 BC, at the age of 39, Cleopatra took her own life. Whether by a venomous asp hidden in a basket or by a needle laced with poison, none can say for certain. Her 2 loyal attendants, Eris and Charmian, died beside her. When Octavian's men entered, they found the queen lying on a golden couch arrayed in royal robes, her crown still upon her brow, serene in death. Though Octavian was angered by her defiance, he allowed her to be buried with royal honors beside Antony, as she had wished. Thus ended the reign of the last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who had defied empires and enchanted Rome itself. Her son Caesarion, barely 17, fled toward Upper Egypt, perhaps hoping to reach Nubia or India. But Octavian's agents lured him back with false promises of mercy. On 29 August 30 BC, he was captured and executed, for, as Octavian's advisor Arrius Didymus warned him, there cannot be two Caesars in one world. Egypt was now a Roman province. The age of the Ptolemies ended forever. Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. In 27 BC, he was given a new name, Augustus, the revered one. And from his rule began the long and glittering era of the Roman Empire.